こんにちは。今日の動画始めます。今日はちょっと長いな。なぜ私たちは死を人間の愛、尊厳、品位、そして変な言い方だろうがユーモアとして取り扱えないのかっていうふうに言ってます。死のことについてですね。なぜ私たちは死を人間の愛、尊厳、品位、そしてユーモアとして取り扱えへんのだろうかって言ってます。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe even humor です。単語が全然わからへんわ。で、コメントは、特にないな。サーテンアマウントオブが一定量のです。はい。で、英語を勉強します。Why can't we treat this? なぜ私たちは死を取り扱えないのか with a certain amount of 一定量の humanity 人間の愛 and dignity 尊厳 and decency 品位 and God forbid これはあれやね。そして変な言い方だろうかのとこやね。God forbid そんなことは断じてないみたいな感じらしいです。Maybe even humor ユーモアです。はい。ちょっと覚えよう。We can't Why we can't we treat this with a certain amount of Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe even humor. Okay. 長いの覚えれる気がせん。聞いていきます。よし。ちょっとくしゃみですわ。くしゃみですわ。よし、始めます。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity, decency, God forbid, me? ちょっともう一回聞いてみよう。一応発音してみよう。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity, dignity, decency, God forbid, me? 追いついてへんわ。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity, dignity, decency, and God forbid, maybe. 早いね。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity, dignity, and decency, and God forbid, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and... 広告や。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good faith, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility? Why can't we treat this? 全然言えて。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency? Go for it. Why can't we treat this with a Why can't we treat this a certain amount of Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and God forbid? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and God forbid, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity ね。humanity. Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe humor? Why can't we treat it with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat it with Why can't we treat this with a鼻もこしょばい。Why can't we treat this? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and God... Ouch! Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and decency and ouch! 広告や。Dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor. With that amount. Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Said. Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and惜しい。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and no... Why can't we treat this with the death of human... Why can't we treat it...あかんわ。カチカチなってる。Why can't we... Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and decency and dignity and... Why can't we treat this with this and a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and good... Why can't we treat with this? Why can't we treat... Why can't we treat this? なんか、全然言えへんわ。カチカチなってる。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and no... Why can't we treat with this? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain humanity and dignity and decency and good for it maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and good for it maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and good for it maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and 棒読みやん。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go to with maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Oh. Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go for maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and go forward maybe with humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good for me to maybe even humor? おせっかく言えたのに、コマーシャルよ。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good for me, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat with a certain amount of dignity and decency and good for me, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good for me, maybe even humor? Why can't we treat this with a certain... Oh, 言えへんかった。終わった。終わりましたね。最後の方良かったね。なぜ私たちは死を人間の愛、尊厳、品位、そして変な言い方やけど、ユーモアとして取り扱えないのか。Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humanity and dignity and decency and God forbid even honor, humor です。はい。dignity and decency. OK。で、それを早く言ってて、Why can't we treat this with a certain amount of humility and dignity and decency and good for it maybe even humor っていう感じで言ってました。そんな感じです。お疲れ様です。